In this chapter, we examine biodiversity through the lens of trying to interrupt the negative effects of human impact on populations. So, this is chapter 9, Sustaining Biodiversity, Saving Species, and Ecosystems. The first aspect of the chapter, of course, is a case study. There's actually several case studies in this particular chapter. A key to the success of California as a state economically has been our agricultural productivity. We're not only able to feed our population, but we export grown goods as well, and that helps our economy. Bees play a key role in that success, and that they are pollinators. European honeybees pollinate over 70% of vegetable and fruit crops. Commercial beekeeping adds between 15 and 20 billion in economic value to agriculture each year. The big crop in California is almonds, and there's a mixed opinion about whether it's actually ethical or whether we should continue the use of bees for pollination, and if there's any kind of negative effects. As the bees are now an important part of our industry, even though they were imported a long time ago, we rely on this bee population. The bee population has undergone some difficulties over the last few years, though. There's colony collapse disorder, is an event where all bees will just abandon a colony, and it's affected between 23 to 43% of European honeybees in the United States between 2008 and 2015, and that's just because this is really like where the research has stopped. So it's kind of the consensus is that it's calmed down to some degree, but it's just because bee keepers have pretty much learned how to manage the populations, even in light of the colony collapse disorder. The idea is now is that bee populations have kind of stabilized, but it's not totally correct. We seem to be managing better and making some progress on finding stability. It is definitely a cost that gets added into the price of produce and food products that utilize bees, though, because within the supply chain, if you have to use bees, if you're relying on bees, there is a large cost that's getting passed down to the consumer, because the rising cost of using bees it really has been affected by the difficulty with bee populations. There's a link in this slide to an interesting opinion piece about the cost to beekeepers and whether or not it's maintained, whether or not they can maintain this in the industry. Here's a picture of a honeybee. This is a European honeybee. They were imported. They were not endemic to North America, but they've been here for a very long time. And this one's drawing nectar from a flower. All right, so let's dive into 9.1. Species are becoming extinct at least 1,000 times faster than what we would consider the normal rate, the historical rate of extinction. By the end of this century, the extinction rate is expected to be 10,000 times higher. Biological extinction, by definition, occurs when a species can no longer be found anywhere on Earth. So we need to really examine the question, what role do humans play in the loss of species and ecosystem services? Sometimes through examination of fossil records, we see a sharp increase in the rate at which extinctions happen. Extinction is a natural process, and there's a natural rate at which organisms cycle out of the current profile of organisms. This is called background extinction, and this is when approximately one species is going extinct per year for every 1 million species that are present on the Earth. A mass extinction is when many species go extinct within a relatively short period of time. This time period relates to the ecosystem and the reproductive capacity of the individual population, or maybe the individual or the type of organisms that are affected within a mass extinction. For ecosystems that are stable and fluctuate very little, even a small rate of increase to the extinction rate can have cascading detrimental effects. Past causes of large extinction events most likely involve global changes in environmental conditions, even if those changes were caused by a preceding natural disaster, quote unquote, like a volcanic eruption, asteroid strike, or the like. So there are many takeaways from this particular section. Mass extinction, they do happen, and but when it does happen, it does give opportunity for species to fill empty ecological niches. I think I said in one of the other chapters that like if all the dinosaurs didn't go extinct, then we really would not have seen the rise of mammals. It's an emptying that allows space for organisms to evolve and to fill in. Human population has destroyed and degraded habitats because we consume a lot of resources. The land area demand that would be needed to grow the biomass to provide energy enough to maintain your lifestyle, that is your ecological footprint. So I'm going to say that one more time. The land area demand, so like the land area needed to grow the biomass that would provide energy needed to maintain your lifestyle. So to make a car, to um, produce your cell phone, to produce all the food that you need, all the clothing that you need, the land that would be needed to create that kind of energy, that is your ecological footprint. For most modern humans, especially those that live in highly developed countries, we have an extremely large ecological footprint. This is kind of like an idea that leads us to understand, that energy is finite and that there's only so much energy, there's only so much space available on the earth. And so the principle is that we must be living above the carrying capacity for humans, and that we're making up a lot of that with technology. So the other thing that you have to think is like there's an energy demand. And if we don't have that amount of energy being captured biologically through photosynthesis currently, we have to be tapping into that amount of energy somewhere. And we get our extra energy from energy that has been stored, and we release it, that stored energy. And that stored energy is actually found in fossil fuels. So we're kind of like energy's been stored up that was captured millions of years ago, and we're tapping into that now as humans. So we need some technology. There's a lot of sunlight that comes in that doesn't get captured. It just leaves again as heat. But we do need to think about like how do we capture some energy efficiently, so that we can make up for that deficit. Because at a certain point, fossil fuels are going to run out. Extinction rates have risen recently. Current extinction rate is 1,000 times faster than the natural background extinction rate, and that's a takeaway as well. The rate of extinction and threats to ecosystem services are likely to continue to rise even more sharply in the next 50 to 100 years due to harmful human impacts. The tragic irony is that large-scale loss of species would greatly impact ecosystem services that humans rely on. So in our current frenzy to build economies and support the current population, biologically diverse environments are being eliminated or fragmented without much thought to how our modern practices will affect our future population. In full disclosure, there are problems in trying to accurately estimate extinction rates. There are several reasons for this. Natural extinction of a species is a long process. Let me go back. There are several reasons for this. Natural extinction of a species is a long process, and it is difficult to document. It's based largely on fossil records. Like our current understanding of extinction and extinction rates is based largely on fossil records. Our fossil records are limited, but we know there's a working rate of speciation and extinction. We know that it's there because of finite energy available that I was discussing before. There's a flow of organisms, if you will. Okay, this is kind of how a reservoir works. There's a flux, there's this influx, right? There's a flux and there's flow. And that's what keeps a reservoir level maintained. If the rates are equal, it stays level. Or stays at a particular level. If the flux increases, then there's going to be a rise in that level. Conversely, if the flow increases and the flux does not, then there would be a drop in the reserves. We've identified only 2 million of the 7 to 10 million species that we estimate are on Earth, and we know very little about the ecological roles of most identified species. So we can't really even begin to predict how an increased rate of extinction will actually affect the overall productivity or stability of our Earth as a biosphere. We do study this currently, but we're limited to what we can observe and how reductions in habitat affect extinction rates. We can only study the areas that are intact, and the loss of those areas really diminishes our capacity to understand the whole system. So it's like it's a race to really understand the earth biologically. Endangered and threatened species are ecological smoke alarms. So let's kind of define some of the terms surrounding the scarcity of particular species. It's determined within ecology, but then there are markers, and there's actually a process for getting this name endangered species. It has to be kind of proven scientifically, and we'll go over that like toward the end of the chapter. But endangered species are those species with so few individuals that the species could soon become extinct, like their negative growth rate in the population, and they're very vulnerable. That there are some distinct characteristics to how that term is applied. Threatened species are vulnerable as well, but there's still enough individuals to survive. Numbers may be declining, may soon become endangered, and many species have characteristics that make them vulnerable to extinction. So these are examples of organisms that are critically endangered species. Um, they are currently threatened with extinction, largely because of human activities, and the number of each one is below the photo. So we've got like the Mexican gray wolf, there's about 42 in the wild in the forests of Arizona and New Mexico. The California condor, even though it's protected and it is actually part of efforts to bring back the population, there are 225 in the southwestern United States. It used to only be 9 in 1986. The number of whooping cranes in North America is 437, and then the Sumatran tiger, you see there, 400 to 600, not totally sure how many, but are on the Indonesian island of Sumatra. So those are examples of endangered species. Some of the characteristics that would put certain species in greater danger of becoming extinct have to do with, let's say, their reproductive capacity being particularly low. An organism that is a case strategist is just simply not going to produce the same number of species, so their reproductive rate is really low. Specialized niche, narrow distribution, feeds at a high trophic level. This means that they're going to be subject to bioaccumulation. There are also less individuals. Fixed migratory patterns, an organism that is rare, commercially valuable, or they require large territories. Those are characteristics that are going to put organisms at a higher risk of going extinct. An intact ecosystem is more stable and more reproductive, more resilient than a fragmented one, and it is difficult to really place a value on economic services. But if ecosystems don't filter water, then we need the technology to do that. If they don't capture carbon and produce enough food for us, then we're going to need the technology to solve that problem. If we do not have natural ecosystems intact, whatever function it is they carry out will not be adequately carried out. And then, therefore, we would need some kind of technology to replace that ecosystem service. It would cost us as a human society to develop that kind of technology. So there are like irreplaceable values, and it's not like we can just put like a money value on it. It can take millions of years for nature to recover from large-scale extinctions. Many people believe that species have the right to exist regardless of their usefulness to humans. But this is definitely a question that comes up when we're dealing with extinction and putting value. Like, it's too costly to protect this organism. And it's like, well, it's too costly to let that organism go extinct. So there's kind of a conflict of interest in terms of ideas. Here is an example of a species that is a vital part of Earth's natural habitat and natural system. Orangutans are endangered. There are only about 61,000 that remain in the wild. The tropical forest habitat that they are endemic to is being cleared to grow palm oil. I know we already kind of introduced this story last week. They are illegally smuggled and sold. They have one of the lowest birth rates of all animals, and they may disappear within 2 decades if without like a really urgent protective action, an interruption to that. These endangered orangutans depend on rapidly disappearing tropical rainforests in Borneo. So, what difference will it make if human activities hasten the extinction of orangutan? Um, let's see, maybe hit play on this one.
Margarine, frozen pizza, chocolate. Our fridge is full of palm oil. This vegetable oil is all around us in our daily lives, in biscuits, hand lotions, detergents, and nowadays also in the fuel for diesel engines. The low-cost product palm fat can be found in every second product in our household. Even a fifth of Laura's breakfast spread consists of palm oil. Palm oil is a success story, but at the expense of the tropical rainforest. On Sumatra, the rainforest is constantly being burnt down to make room for new plantations. Every year, an area the size of 1,000,000 soccer pitches is destroyed. Amidst these huge monocultures, only small patches of rainforest remain. The rainforest is a treasure trove of biodiversity. Almost half of all the world's plant and animal species live here. But this biological diversity is under threat. Elephants, tigers, rhinos, and many other species are losing their home. The same is true for the orangutan. Made homeless, they starve, burn to death, or are killed. Young animals who survive the death of their mothers are kidnapped and sold on the black market for considerable sums of money. They are illegally kept as pets in small cages and under miserable conditions. Many die due to malnutrition and social isolation, but a few are lucky as they are reported. The Nature Conservation Agency then confiscates the orangutan that was held captive and takes the animal to the quarantine station operated by the Sumatran Orangutan Conservation Program as fast as possible. There, the orangutan is thoroughly examined and, if needed, receives medical care. As soon as the animal is healthy and old enough, it is taken to a so-called socialization cage. Living together with fellow orangutans makes significant progress possible. When the orangutan is ready for resettlement in the wild, the team takes the animal to the reintroduction station deep in the rainforest. There, the animal learns step by step what is necessary for a life in freedom. Under the observation of the team, the animal gets in contact with orangutans already released and spends more and more time in the rainforest until one day the animal does not return to the station. To ensure the long-term survival of the orangutans, additional steps are taken. We monitor the behavior of the released orangutans and their habitat. We collect scientific data and evidence of violations of regulations. Jointly with our partners, we expose criminal acts of palm oil companies. We provide information and create awareness. From now on, Laura will pay attention to what she buys, because what happens on Sumatra affects us all. Keep your eyes open and do not buy any products which contain palm oil. For all of us, the rainforest is critically important, but how we act is also critically important for the rainforest. Act responsibly now.
Species provide vital ecosystem services, things like pollination, pest control, oxygen production. Many plants and animals provide economic value, sometimes even medicinal drugs, for instance. Extinction can hinder speciation that would lead to the arrival of more services that are not even part of our genetic biodiversity yet, things that that haven't even evolved. So many people believe species have an intrinsic right to exist, but if you think about that, in order to change the practices that lead to extinctions, we're arguing less with individuals. It's not, yeah, like who's like, oh yeah, animals should exist. However, it's more about the practice. We argue more with the collective practices that arise as a result of the phenomenon of the collective practice. Species provide vital ecosystem services, things like pollination, pest control, oxygen production. Many plants and animals provide economic value, medicinal drugs, for instance. Extinction can hinder speciation that would actually lead to the arrival of more services that are not even yet evolved, are not yet available. Many people believe species have the intrinsic right to exist, but if you think about it, in order to challenge the practices that lead to extinctions, we're arguing less with the individuals and more with the collective practices that arise as a result of the phenomenon of collective thinking. This can be caused by the pressure for economic growth. This can be caused by tradition. This can be caused by the need for convenience. And it is often exacerbated by our separation from nature. We live in cities and we don't really think the consequences to wild spaces. And if we aren't very aware of the impact of the process of like obtaining that product, if we don't know what it costs to those wild spaces and to organisms that may be threatened, it's easy for us to just continue buying because we're very, very separated. So it may be a matter of convenience, it may be a matter of culture. And just as there are emergent properties from one biological level to another, human societies have practices that bring consequences that emerge as a result of several complicated variables. The value that arises culturally may not be the intention of the individuals, but may become the impact of the population at large. Like if you are asked about littering, the citizens of a society typically are not going to individually value litter, but the place that they live in may be full of trash because the accumulatory nature of littering is not fully realized, right? Like some people are like, it's just one thing here, it's just one thing there. Well, if everybody says that, then all of a sudden you have a space that's full of litter. And the practice may be accepted for the sake of convenience. Well, there wasn't a trash can around. I didn't know where to put it. It's like the idea is that we're kind of separated from that consequence. The phenomenon of the collective practice and what motivates individual behavior, it's really complex. And finding ways to change that behavior is even more difficult to understand. So the other complication then is the limited resources. Which species do we actually funnel our resources into protecting? Difficult things to talk about, but good stuff. All right, here are some examples of natural capital. These plants are species that we kind of deem nature's pharmacy. Once, so each of these have a natural ingredient that has, it's been identified, and there's like a medicinal value to it. Okay, so you can see quinine, can treat malaria, and these are all just coming straight from plants. Rosy periwinkle from Madagascar is another treatment for cancer, specifically a cancer that affects children. But these are all coming from areas that have particular threats to them, too. So it's like we have processes that could cause these organisms to go extinct. And we would have never, like, if it happened before we ever discovered the medicinal value, that would just have been tragic, right? The neem tree. Neem helps with the treatment of many diseases. It's used as a natural insecticide and spermicide. There are many more examples as well. Many species of wildlife, such as this endangered hyacinth macaw in Brazil, actually, I don't even think that they exist in the wild. I think that they are only in captivity. They are sources of beauty and pleasure. Habitat loss and illegal capture in the wild by pet traders has endangered this particular species. I think the movie Rio, is about that. How do humans accelerate species extinction and degradation of ecosystems? There's kind of this acronym, a mnemonic acronym called HIPCO. It used to just be hippo, and then we needed to add a C, so it's HIPCO now. But the greatest threats to these species can be remembered through it. And it's H for habitat loss, degradation, or fragmentation. I for invasive or non-native species. P for population and resource use growth. We're talking about that idea of ecological footprint. Pollution, climate change, and overexploitation. Habitat destruction and fragmentation, specifically, so that's the first one. That occurs when large intact habitat is divided into smaller isolated patches. So you saw in the video about the orangutans, they're like the rainforest used to be we would call it intact, like there wasn't an interruption to it. Orangutans need territory, they need space, they need to be able to migrate and move through the jungle. And if you have only like incomplete patches of jungle separated out by palm oil plantations, you don't have a habitat. This can be caused by roads, logging, crops, urban development. Barriers limit species' ability to disperse and to colonize, and sometimes they can also put them at risk of dying in migratory pathways. So some of our insects that migrate through like California, they have to cross the 5 freeway, which is like a constant flow of traffic, and a lot of their populations don't make it across, don't make it by the freeway. Natural capital degradation. Here's some examples of that. These maps reveal the reductions in the ranges of 4 wildlife species, mostly as a result of severe habitat loss and fragmentation, or even maybe through illegal hunting for their valuable body parts. Would you support expanding these ranges, even though this would reduce the land that's available for human habitat and farming? So this is the kind of the dilemma that a lot of countries face. So like, do we protect land and hold it for wild places for animals, or do we just get to use everything up as humans? This is an example of fragmented landscapes being used for agriculture. This is actually a lot like what California looks like. So degrading grassland and forest wildlife habitats um, is part of that like habitat loss and destruction. So the I stood for invasive species. Many species introductions can be beneficial, as we discussed earlier with the European bees. It's been a successful addition to North America, but it hasn't been without consequence. The reason there have not been a lot of problems with that particular introduction has a lot to do with the way bees live in colonies. However, there are many introductions that have gone very, very wrong. We'll talk about some more of those later on this week. Non-native species may have no natural predators, no competition. There may not be parasites or pathogens that would control their population. So there's no population control. Non-native species can crowd out native species, and if they are harmful, they are viewed as invasive species. Here are some famous invasive species. Purple leucostrife, the African honeybee, deemed killer bee. Kudzu, which we'll show a little bit more about. Nutria. These have been deliberately introduced into the United States. European wild boar, sea lamprey, Argentinian fire ant, Burmese python, Formosan termite, and the zebra mussel. Um, so kudzu is like the case study piece. Like, it was imported from Japan in the 1930s because it grew really fast and they thought, oh, we'll help control soil erosion. Well, it spreads rapidly and it took over land. It was very difficult to kill. Common fungus can kill kudzu vine, but we need to investigate some harmful side effects because since we're just not sure uh, biologically if there could be any other organism that might be harmed by that in the areas that like the kudzu is taken over. It's invasive, but they don't want to use a fungus to keep it at bay because that fungus may spread to other plants and then cause further destruction. Potential benefits of kudzu is its medicinal and nutritional uses. It has potential use as paper or biofuel. So trying to figure out how to keep it under control. So you'll see in the next picture. This is the kind of overgrowth and destruction that can happen. So kudzu is grown over this car. This is in Georgia. So it's very difficult to get it to, like, you go away for a vacation or something, or you don't use your car for a while, and the kudzu just take over. There's a bug also that has become invasive. It probably came with the vine at some point or was introduced separately, but then found its preferred food source. It was not introduced to try to counteract the kudzu, but research refutes that. I don't know what the actual story is. But it's established a population of significant numbers, and it's considered a serious agricultural nuisance now. This is the kudzu bug. Not dangerous necessarily, but it definitely is a nuisance. Sometimes there are examples of predators that are accidentally introduced, like the Burmese python, African python, and the boa constrictor. These were, probably purchased as pets. They're from the exotic trade. They come from Africa and Asia, and then they were released into the Florida wetlands, the Everglades. Predation by these animals alters food webs and therefore becomes a problem for the ecosystem because it interrupts the ecosystem services of the natural members of that particular ecosystem. Here's an example. So this is a Burmese python that was hunted and captured. Can you even imagine? What if you were just like walking along, taking a little walk along a trail, and that is what you saw? Oof. How do we control invasive species? There are research programs that have, like an investment of money in order to identify invaders, to track invasive species. It takes boots on the ground, if you will, ground surveys and satellite observations in order to establish um, a sense of what damage has been caused by an invasive species. We have to establish international treaties and ban transfer between countries, and that can sometimes prove to be difficult. Public education about releasing exotic pets and plants is obviously necessary. So what can you do? Don't buy wild plants and animals. Don't remove them from natural areas. Don't release wild pets into natural areas. Don't dump aquarium contents or unused fishing bait into waterways or storm drains. When camping, use local firewood. Don't actually bring, wood from home, because you might accidentally give a hitchhiker a ride into an area where it could become invasive. Brush or clean your dogs and your hiking boots and mountain bikes and boats, and be a responsible user of wild areas. Prevention is the best way to reduce threats from invasive species. On the HIPCO, population growth and high rates of resource use, population, and climate change, we're all bundled in here together. We're going to talk about them as one. Human growth and the rising resource use per person complicates the control of invasive species. With population growth, there's a growing demand for goods and services. So, as a society, we've continued to grow and we have expanded our commercial shipping, whether that's by ocean, air, or land travel. There's an increase of movement from continent to continent, and this factor creates complications for controlling the movement of species that would naturally remain isolated. So, just by having a higher population, we degrade more wildlife habitat and we see more invasive species. Production of goods also causes more pollution. The production of agricultural products typically requires, more like pesticides and insecticides, and commercially grown foods don't necessarily value organic practices. So then you have, as a consequence, bioaccumulation of pesticides and other chemical products in individual organisms that would come in contact with them. Biomagnification and bioaccumulation are big problems for birds. Have a big field of corn and blackbirds are going in and they're eating that corn, and that corn has been sprayed with a pesticide. The blackbird population will bioaccumulate that pesticide in their body, especially if it's something that isn't being metabolized out. Then biomagnification occurs when that chemical becomes more concentrated as the food energy in a food pyramid moves up that food chain. Climate change of these, like population, pollution, and climate change. Climate change will accelerate what we refer to as the sixth extinction now, which is a major loss of diversity in ecosystems that we are experiencing currently. Okay, this is the example of bioaccumulation and biomagnification. So you can see bioaccumulation is going to happen at each of those levels, and then biomagnification happens as resources are fed on. Okay, so the birds get the highest amount because they are feeding on the needlefish. Needlefish have, like it says, 2 parts per million per needlefish, and so then there's a bioaccumulation within the osprey, and then in the food chain, biomagnification. Each feeding level, there is a greater biomagnification of the toxin that cannot be metabolized out. With the increase of our ecological footprint, we have many examples of cascading degradation to systems that are not even fully realized until there's some effect years or even decades after the initial chemical or practices become part of the structure of a particular industry. One example is this use of DDT. And the long-term effects on ecosystems that were not realized until DDT was in full production and use worldwide. So bioaccumulation and biomagnification are a result of that. This drove the bald eagle almost to extinction, and it has been part of a protection program and a reintroduction program, and we've seen success, but this happened only after DDT was banned from use in the 1960s, and it's taken a very long time for that slow reproductive rate, very few individual apex predator. It's taken a very long time for that to bounce back. A little bit more on the honeybee losses. We examine in 9.2, the science focus, the European honeybee population losses and look at some of the reasons the populations have been cut in half over 50 years. Some study points for you to look at are some of the possible reasons: parasites, viruses, pesticide use, stress from transportation because bee boxes are loaded into semi trucks, and overwork. There's actually a demand. You move from place to place, and it puts kind of like this instinctual demand on honeybees to get out and find out what the crop that is there. And then poor nutrition from pollinating on single crops, since we have monoculture and bees are being employed mostly for almonds. They're only getting pollination that's coming from almond trees. So scientists believe that that's part of the reason there was a collapse. Illegal killing, capturing, and selling of wild species is the next topic, and it is a difficult one. I just want to let you know. The poaching and smuggling of protected animals is basically an organized crime ring. It's involved in huge profits. Elephants and rhinos are killed for their tusks and horns. Tigers can be poached for their skins and other body parts. And there's demand for birds and amphibians, reptiles, tropical fish. So I'm going to warn you right now that the next slide is pretty graphic. It's hard to look at, but it is a reality that we need to correct. So this is a South African white rhinoceros that was killed by a poacher, and its two horns were taken, and the species is now extinct in the wild. And so the book poses the question, like, what would you say to a poacher like this? But this is the obvious kind of end result, that now they're extinct. The next two case studies are also difficult to talk about, but it's important that we discuss them, and awareness is really the first step to solving a problem. So the first one, A Disturbing Message from the Birds, discusses the causes of a very startling decline in bird populations that is currently taking place. So primarily these are in the tropical regions. 1/3 of the bird species that are threatened in the United States are actually found in Hawaii. The most impactful cause is habitat loss or degradation, and this can be especially difficult for migratory bird species as they have particular breeding behaviors, and these are typically tied to certain ecosystems. And if those ecosystems get degraded, then they don't breed, or it interrupts those processes. And if you've ever watched like wildlife documentaries where they showcase birds, their mating and breeding behaviors are really elaborate, and often they have to have certain materials to build nests, and they may go back to the same breeding ground. Well, if that breeding ground gets interrupted, then it will interrupt the breeding process. So after habitat loss, competition from invasive species is attributed with threatening 28% of the world's bird species, and 52 of the world's 388 parrot species are threatened. This comes from typically with the birds, it comes from pet trade. That's that overexploitation. Exposure to pesticides is an issue. 40% of water birds are in decline due to global loss of wetlands, and wetlands are easily converted over for urban development or especially for agriculture, which exposes birds to pesticides. Since birds are typically higher on the food chain, bioaccumulation of toxins is definitely a problem, and it can affect reproduction and morphology being the development of the body. So because birds respond very quickly to environmental changes, they are considered an indicator species. Reproduction is a delicate and vulnerable process for birds because they are oviparous, which means they produce eggs. And egg production is crucial, and any chemicals that inhibit or cause like thinning of the eggshell can inhibit reproduction. Birds perform critical ecosystem and economic services, so extinctions affect many other species. There would be cascade effects involved in the loss of birds. From seed carriers to the suppression of parasite populations to cleaning up dead carcasses, birds are definitely keystone contributors. I do want to recommend a documentary on Amazon called The Parrot Confidential. So if you have Amazon Prime, you should watch it just to raise your own personal awareness. I think I mentioned it before, but wanted to do it again. The second case study is a rising demand for bushmeat and how that threatens some African species, much like the rhino photo. So be warned, bushmeat is a traditional source of food in West and Central Africa, and as population has grown, hunting wildlife has skyrocketed over the past 3 decades. One species, a red colobus monkey, is actually extinct, and there are reduced populations of orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees, even elephants and hippos. The USAID, or U.S. Agency for International Development, is an example of one agency attempting to introduce methods for breeding alternative sources of protein for villagers. All right, warning on the picture, but here it comes. Bushmeat, such as the severed head of an endangered lowland gorilla in the Congo, is consumed as a source of protein by local people in parts of West and Central Africa. So this is a traditional behavior, but now it's also sold on the national and international marketplaces and served in some restaurants where wealthy patrons regard gorilla meat as a source of status and power. Some populations have never moved out all the way out of hunter-gatherer society traditions, but their population numbers have grown beyond the capacity of the surrounding ecosystems to support these practices. So there's definitely a need to remove societal practices that harm ecosystems. But there is a crucial need to do it with sensitivity for the autonomy and the value of these countries' histories. It's a difficult balance. As an American, even if you're recently established as an American, like you come here as your family's immigrants, there's definitely a sense that the Western world is somehow better in practice and that we regulate exploitation more readily, but we are definitely part of the problem. We're not any better, but sometimes within the educated community, there is this like sense that like, oh, how dare they? The West is practically and historically speaking, like the Western European countries and the imperialized regions of Africa, Asia, and North American continents. Somehow we think we're better at this of protecting species, but it's simply not true. Sometimes we won't look at our own stories. We're so quick to look around at what seems to be kind of like an exotic story and point out what's going on and the abuses that are happening, but we really need to take a look at our own abuse of wildlife. Ways to reduce species extinction and sustain ecosystem services is through establishing and enforcing national and international environmental laws and international treaties and really holding up our end, and then creating protected wildlife sanctuaries, which takes a lot of money. It takes commitment from people who have money. Instead of investing in commercial development, is just to invest in conservation. It takes a special kind of person to make that kind of decision with their money. So it doesn't happen as often as we want it to. Enforcing regulations across international borders is a difficult task. So in 1975, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, or CITES for short, was established. This convention was signed by 181 countries. Representatives from these countries make up the governing body that is CITES and determines what species should be protected through the official lists and qualifications of threatened species, endangered species, and critically endangered species. So you have to go before the CITES convention and bring evidence that an organism needs protection. And so scientists actually do that in studies, and they go before CITES, and that's where they'll get declared as an endangered species. According to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the United States has been committed to promoting openness and transparency in the CITES process and decision-making because we believe that the principles strengthen and encourage efficiency, accountability, and effectiveness. There has been a concern historically and for a long time for kind of like a conflict of interest. So there's increasingly frequent use of secret ballots at these at the conventions, and particularly for votes on species listing proposals. So like whether something's going to get listed as endangered or not. And sometimes there's a politic involved, like there's a lot of politics involved in whether or not a country will support something being listed. Well, if their economy is being bolstered by basically what should be illegal trade, they may vote against it. And if it's secret, then there's no sanctions from country to country on that. So the United States has been a voice trying to like make sure that we get fair representation for all organisms, and that there isn't like a corrupt black market um, influence in CITES. But there's definitely some decision making and potential for conflicts that happen within that voting body, and it is complicated. The Convention on Biological Diversity, or the CBD, is an international legal instrument for the conservation of biological diversity that is the arm of the UN. The conservation of biological diversity, the sustainable use of its components, and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising out of the utilization of genetic resources. That was ratified by 196 countries. The US is actually not a member, and there are differing opinions about why that is and what the implications for our absence are, because we are part of CITES, but we will not join CBD. This is under the UN, and there's an opinion piece on this attached to that. It's linked for you, just so that you can kind of get your international awareness as far as like knowing who regulates international trade and who regulates um, the international trade of like goods and species and all of that, like, and who's gonna regulate whether or not something is considered illegal. So there's a lot of politics. It's not easy. It's not an easy like process to protect organisms that need it. So it's very interesting. The CBD really lacks enforcement mechanisms, and that may be part of why the United States won't be part of it. But we have our own Endangered Species Act, which was signed into law in 1973 and has been amended several times since then. The law works to identify and protect endangered species in the US and abroad, and creates recovery programs for listed species. So we do put money into other places, especially in US territories, though. And it established the National Marine Fisheries Service for ocean species, and also the US Fish and Wildlife Services for like basically every other organism. So the Endangered Species Act houses a lot of funding and laws and enforcement, and there's like that law brought a lot of different programs into the United States. The Endangered Species Act forbids federal agencies, except for the the Defense Agency, which I'm like, from funding projects that jeopardize endangered or threatened species. So if it's a matter of war, somehow it's okay. We have some things to think about there. It requires commercial shipments of wildlife to come through certain ports. In 2015, 1,591 species were officially listed. 90% of the Endangered Species Act protected species are recovering at projected rate. So we have success with that program. Environmental policy begins when citizens take an interest in what is happening, or corporations seek out solutions to issues, or nonprofits or non-governmental agencies will, or non-governmental organizations really take an interest in protecting the environment or protecting species. Policy life cycle usually looks like this: identify a problem, you got to get some research underlying the science behind an issue, craft a policy solution, monitor how well it works, adjust the policy as needed. One such example is our wildlife refuges and other areas that we have that are protected land. In 1903, Theodore Roosevelt established the first federal wildlife refuge, and that was Pelican Island in Florida. Wildlife refuges are most of them are wetland sanctuaries. They provide habitat for 1/4 of the U.S. threatened or endangered species. The issue with wildlife refuges is, though there still are harmful activities such as mining, drilling, and using off-road vehicles that are legal, so that they are protected to a certain degree, but there are still activities that happen on the land that don't necessarily benefit species. And it really comes from the fact that these wildlife refuges were first established for human use and for hunting. So that was like, hey, we need wildland so that we can go and exploit the animals. So we kind of got in through that in a backwards way, but it's yeah, it needs to be revisited for sure. This is Pelican Island, the first national refuge, and this is in Florida. Some other methods that in the scientific community that are used for preserving biodiversity, or like at least cataloging the species that are disappearing at alarming rates, are things like seed banks, which preserve the genetic material of endangered plants, botanical gardens, or arboretums, where that gives space to rare or endangered species. It gives them a protected place to live, and at least we can study. Sometimes farms can raise organisms for commercial sale, and that if something is rare, then they'll get it farmed and it can be propagated more quickly. And so that works for plants. Zoos and aquariums are typically kind of the method for trying to reestablish a population for organisms that may be going through a difficult time in terms of numbers. These are some of the techniques that might be part of a repopulation effort that maybe you might see in a zoo or an aquarium as kind of like the arm of wildlife recovery and protection. So techniques that you would see: egg pulling, captive breeding. You've probably heard of that before. Artificial insemination, embryo transfer, use of incubators, and cross fostering. We have a lot of strategies within wildlife sciences for trying to support populations being reestablished. This is the Monterey Bay Aquarium in Monterey, California. And this is a tidewater pool that is used to train rescued sea pups, that they tried to train them and give them the skills that they would need to go and be released and survive in the wild. All right, so a couple of principles that we see at work or that I want to advocate for, and that kind of are core ideas for environmental science. One is the precautionary principle: act to prevent and reduce harm when preliminary evidence indicates acting is needed. Good strategy in other areas of life as well, like preventing exposure to harmful chemicals in our air and our food and our water. So prevention is, they say like prevention is the best medicine. Well, the precautionary principle is that. And if we apply it to wildlife, then conservation and not developing, not changing land, not allowing for the exploitation, not allowing rainforests to be taken down. That's really the principle that we're going to see. There's an emphasis on preventing species extinction that way. Act early rather than when a species is near extinction. Should we focus on protecting species or whole ecosystems and the services they provide? And so that question right there, you probably could guess my position on it, but it's definitely something that is at the forefront of discussions with how to move forward in terms of our impact and our growing population as human society and as a global society, really. How to decide which species get attention. It's always easy to get someone to want to protect a cuddly, fuzzy mammal, but what about an ugly looking lizard, but that is like, a big keystone species? It's hard to get people to really understand how important one species is in a community or to an ecosystem unless they really understand the whole ecological moray of principles. So protecting species is appealing to humans, and it can increase public awareness of the need. And maybe if we can tug on heartstrings for one species, then people begin to understand why it's important to protect habitat and how to determine which habitat areas to protect. How do we allocate resources, because resources are limited? These are all questions that come up when looking at policy and really understanding like what we need to do. Protecting species. Don't buy furs. Do not buy ivory. Don't buy other items made of endangered or threatened animal species. And don't turn a blind eye when you think that something's happening. Don't buy wood or wood products from tropical or old growth forests. And don't buy pets or animals or plants that are taken from the wild. Tell friends and relatives what you're doing about this problem. Raise awareness. Have discussions. Be that crazy person in your family. It takes a brave soul to do it, especially if it's not a value that you see in your family. Everybody in my family likes to make fun of me for recycling and being the hippie and really promoting, but it's important for us to be good stewards of this earth, and somebody has to stand up and be the Lorax, right? I got to speak for the trees.